Hello, and welcome to the Off-Highway Global Briefing, organised by Off-Highway Research. I'm Chris Slight, Managing Director of Off-Highway Research, and I'll be your host today. So thank you very much for joining us. We have over 600 people registered for this event, which we hope will give you insights into new data we've compiled looking into sales of construction equipment by customer group. This information has been gleaned from our reports on the equipment markets in Europe, which includes sections breaking down sales by customer types. By standardizing the language used and building a database around this information, we've been able to develop a tool which provides a lot of new possibilities for analysis and gaining greater insights into the market. In today's webinar, I'll be sharing some of those insights with you. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors, Lawson's Recruitment, whose support has helped make this webinar possible. And thanks also to our media partner, Construction Europe magazine. I'd also say at this point that the slides from the presentation will be available to you. And just after the webinar ends, you'll be receiving an email with a link to download them. So with that, we'll start the presentation now. There'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. If you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A channel. So as you're here, I imagine you know a little bit about off-highway research, but for those who don't, we're a specialist in the research and analysis of construction equipment markets around the world, the largest consultancy of its kind in the world, and we were 40 this year. The business was established as part of the Economist Intelligence Unit back in 1981. Since 2015, the business has been owned by KHL Group, which is the leading media and events company for the construction equipment world. And Off-Highway Research has its own offices in strategic locations in China, Germany, India, Japan, UK, and USA, and of course, many more locations throughout the world through the wider KHL network. So what's on the agenda today? As I said in the introduction, the focus is on Europe. Just a quick introduction about what's happening in the market in terms of the market size and the trends we're seeing, and a little bit about the structure of the market. And then we're going to dive into this new information on buyer groups. We're going to have a look at the differences from country to country, which are very significant. The differences from machine type to machine type, which perhaps more obviously are very different. How that's changed over time. And we're also going to come at it from the point of view of the different buyer groups. And finally, a few words about machine populations, which is something that's very important to people that have any sort of interest in the aftermarket. As I said, this has all been gleaned from our new service, the Customer Groups Database Service, which is now available. And what it does is gives equipment sales by customer type. We have 9 broad types, including the ones you would expect: contractors, rental companies, extraction being mining and quarrying. And that covers 15 equipment types in Europe. And we also plan to add more countries as this new initiative gains ground. The historic data goes back to 2010, so there are trends to be plotted. And as with all our data, there's a 5-year sales forecast. So that's by equipment type, by customer group, and by country. So it allows a lot of different ways to slice and dice the information and gain an understanding of the market. So when I talk about the market, I'm talking about these equipment types which are on screen now. Obviously, everybody has a slightly different measure of the market, but this is what I'm talking about, and this is what we have customer group information about. So first off, a quick word about the European market, the long-term trend, what's happening sort of in life after COVID or life in the pandemic and coming out of it, hopefully, a little bit about the structure and equipment preferences. For this chart, I've gone back to 2010, so we're matching the data set that we have available for the customer group information. And you see here really how the market has grown from a low point in 2010, just after the global financial crisis, a fairly sort of flat to downish period in the early 2010s. And then in the second half of that decade, pretty good growth, taking the market to a pretty high level in 2019. Of course, last year in 2020, we had a downturn because of the impacts of COVID, about 15%. So a fairly steep fall, but I think if you look at the kind of volumes that were achieved, that was still a fairly healthy market. And now this year, we've had a very, very strong bounce back, probably a lot stronger than anyone would have expected a year ago. The volumes have come back to almost what they were in 2019. And I'm sure if we didn't have all the problems about shipping, logistics and supply chain, that the volume this year would have exceeded 2019. We're therefore kind of quite hopeful that in 2022, we do get a new cyclical high in Europe as that demand remains, and hopefully some of those supply chain and logistics issues are sorted out. And thereafter, a reasonably buoyant market, we would hope, but obviously as we enter the sort of the post-COVID world, those things become more uncertain. In terms of the structure of the market, sales in Europe revolve around really sort of 5 high volume equipment types. The highest volume of all is the mini excavator, accounting for almost 40% of sales now. The other high volume machines are things like telehandlers, crawler and wheeled excavators. Which one sells depends a little bit in which country you're looking at. And then also wheel loaders, which are again one of the higher volume machines. There are still sales of backhoe loaders and skid steer loaders in Europe, but these machine types really aren't what they once were. And certainly if you went back into the 90s and 80s, you would see the decline of these machines in favor of mini excavators and telehandlers. And of course, we cover quite a few machine types. In Europe, most of them are fairly low volume machines. So you're talking about the heavier earth moving equipment, dump trucks, dozers, graders, and so on. So not very big in terms of unit sales, but obviously significant in value terms. And that's something that I'm going to come on to when we look at customer groups. So they're just a quick overview of where the market is in terms of the sales volumes and also what the composition of the market is. So let's dive into the equipment buyers information and just looking at the main buyer groups, how it varies by country, by equipment type, and how it's changing over time. So this is the headline, if you like, the major buyer groups in Europe. The first thing that we found out when we did this analysis is that rental is now the biggest buyer group in Europe. The balance between rental and contractors does ebb and flow slightly from year to year. But so it's not, these percentages are always shifting, but we're fairly clear that in the last 3 or 4 years, the needle has swung from contractors being the biggest buyers to rental. However, the thing I would emphasize is we are talking about unit terms, and I'll come on to talk about value in the next slide. So rental companies are buying the highest number of machines, and contractors are, a similar number, but generally fewer than rental buyers. And then the other sort of broad segments we've identified, agriculture is important in Europe. It's a big buyer of telescopic handlers in particular, and also a few other small equipment types, such as small wheeled and various loading shovels. Another sector which has emerged somewhat in the last decade, I would say, is landscaping, which again tends towards the smaller equipment types. Extraction, by this we mean mining and quarrying. Obviously, this is a sector that's been around for a very long time. It doesn't buy a huge number of machines, but as I said, it does tend to focus very much on the bigger machine types. Another sector which we've identified as emerging through this research is the world of waste management, recycling and demolition. A relatively small volume, but again, they do tend to be slightly bigger machines than the average. So in value terms, as you'll see, that is important, and it is a high growth sector. And then there are, what I would describe as niches. Industry is a bit of a catch-all, to be honest. Construction machines are used by lots of different industries. So we've used this category to just identify industrial applications for construction machines that are outside, construction, quarrying and mining. Another big buyer group, although not as big as it was, is the public sector. So these are things like municipalities that buy machines for maintenance, and also any publicly owned utility companies. And then we have forestry and timber, which is obviously a big industry in certain parts of Europe, but a relatively small consumer of the types of construction machines that we cover. There's obviously a world of forestry equipment, which is outside our coverage. And of course, there's always others and machine sales that you can't really classify. So that's something which exists in all our data, and we'd rather have that in there as others than try and allocate it incorrectly to another segment. So as I said, that's how it looks in unit terms. However, if we go on and estimate the value, you get a very, very different picture. Rental does tend towards the smaller equipment types. So in value terms, it is a smaller slice of the pie. I would stress that these are estimates of value. This is something that we have in the database and is available to our clients, but there are sort of certain limitations on how far you can take this. So it is an estimate, but it does show fairly clearly that in terms of the value of machines sold, contractors are by far the most important group. And of course, around this side of the pie chart, you also see some changes. As I said, the extraction industries doesn't buy a huge number of machines, but it buys big machines. Agriculture buys quite a high number, but they tend to be smaller, as does the landscaping industry particularly. And then again, looking in value terms, you see that waste management, demolition and recycling, while only 3% in unit terms, is more significant in value terms. So as I said, this value data is not hard and fast. It is indicative, I would say, but it does give you a different perspective on the market. And I think that differentiation between looking at volume and looking at value is important for a full understanding. So just to, and some of this may be a little bit obvious if you're familiar with the market, but just to kind of talk about different equipment types. If you pick a machine like a mini excavator and look at unit sales across Europe, probably as you would expect, the highest proportion goes to rental. About, at the moment, 50% of sales of mini excavators goes to rental. There are still quite a lot of sales to contractors. And in our definition, contractors would include the kind of the sole trader, the one person who just owns one machine and works locally. So, that would be a big part of that market. And then, the niches that you would expect pop up in mini excavators, they're obviously important tools for landscaping. And for that public sector, for the utilities and for the municipalities, they are important machines. So, that's a breakdown, and maybe the breakdown that you would expect. But just to illustrate the point, and again, sort of hopefully it's obvious, but I think it does bear discussion, is it is completely different if you look at a big, heavy earth-moving machine type like crawler dozers. There you get more than 60% of the sales to contractors. Interestingly, rental is still the second biggest market. Clearly, there are rental companies that specialize in heavy earth moving, so they are buyers of equipment. But the other kind of customer groups you would expect do pop up. The extraction industries, mining and quarrying, are of course an important market for dozers, as is the sort of the waste management segment, and of course there are a few industrial uses. So I've taken two extremes there, and obviously you are going to get very different profiles for those two machine types. But the point I would make about this data is that you can do this for any machine type and really get quite a deep understanding of who buys what. You can do the same exercise for countries. And again, we found this very, very revealing to really understand the profile of customers in different markets and really understand how they differ. So I have chosen two extremes to illustrate the point. First up is the UK. As many of you will be aware, the UK has, not only the highest rental penetration in Europe, but probably the world. At 66%, 2/3 of equipment sales. That is extremely high, much higher, we believe, than in North America. The next biggest segment is contractors, which, relatively speaking, is very, very small. And then you have these niches, which, you know, kind of about what we saw in the overall European picture. Agriculture, pretty big in volume terms. This waste management, recycling and demolition segment is quite big in the UK compared to the European average. Wherever you go in Europe, extraction is about 3% of sales, public sector, industry, the other bits and pieces. So that's the profile for the UK, again, in unit terms, looking across all equipment types. And compare that to the other end of the spectrum. You could pick pretty much any market in Southern Europe, but I've chosen Italy partly because it's a market of a sort of a similar size. So similar size, similar types of activity, completely different buyer profile. In Italy, you have more than half of machine sales being made to contractors. Excuse me. Rental is there. It is relatively big, perhaps a little bit bigger than you might expect, but it's still a contractor-heavy market. Agriculture is important. The public sector is pretty important in Italy, with about 5% of sales. Then waste management, recycling, about on the European average. Landscaping, probably a bit smaller than the European average, and extraction, you know, there or thereabouts. So as I said, you know, these are two extreme examples. They're about as different as you can get in Europe. But it does illustrate the kind of insight that you can get from this information and the kind of understanding you can start to build. So that's a snapshot of how these markets are right now. Just going to look at changes over time. So here I've just plotted the relative sales from 2010 and out into our forecast period to 2025. I think the first thing you notice about this is there aren't really any huge changes. You see things wibble and wobble about by 1 or 2 percentage points per year, but you don't sort of see any really sharp trends. However, there are a lot of changes going on underneath these headline figures, which kind of underpin it. And the other point that I'm going to come on to make is that while these changes are relatively small on a year-to-year base on this sort of scale, when you really dive into it and look at the different growth characteristics of different customer groups, you do start to see more significant changes. So let's have a look at that. So in 2010, this is how volume sales broke down. As I said at the start, contractors were clearly the biggest buyers, with 38% of the equipment sold in Europe going to them, and rental was second, and these were the smaller groups. If you fast forward to this year, or what we estimate to be this year, rental has caught up, and if we went to one decimal place, you would see rental was ahead there, and contractors have fallen back somewhat. You've also seen, as I said at the start, a little bit of growth in some of these bigger niches, you might describe them as. Extraction has gone down a little bit, but is coming up. But we do see a bit of growth in landscaping and in the waste, recycling, demolition worlds. And these smaller segments, not so much. So this data does point to this rise of rental versus contractor ownership and the rise of some of these bigger niches that we've identified. Again, you know, shifting from 34 to 37% of sales may not seem that big, but if you look at the growth characteristics, it does sort of start to look slightly different. So between 2010 and 2021, there was a lot of growth overall in European equipment sales. 88% over that period, which works out at about 6% compound growth per year. So if you look at these different segments, you start to see that the long-term growth in these segments is different. You see that the sales to rental are growing very much above trend, as are particularly the sales to landscaping, and as I mentioned at the start, the sales to the waste, recycling and demolition industry. Not so much the extraction industry, that's a little bit behind the trend, as is the public sector. So yeah, just emphasizing that. And then sales to a single buyer group, you know, let's just summarize things here. what this data allows you to do is kind of work out where the big rental markets are, where the big extraction markets are, where the big agricultural markets are. And the point I would make is the biggest market for a given customer group is not always the biggest equipment market. I'm going to come on to this a little bit more later, but clearly the UK is the biggest rental market in Europe, but it is not the biggest equipment market. And likewise, the highest selling machines are not always the highest selling machines in a given sector. In some senses, that's obvious. You know, you don't sell many mini excavators into mining, and you don't sell many 100-ton dump trucks into agriculture. But you know, taking those extremes out of it, you will find very different equipment profiles by buyer groups. So that's what I'm going to come on to look at now, is just have a look at a specific buyer group and just kind of see how we can slice and dice it. So what I've done here is extracted the data that looks at the unit sales to the rental industry over the last 10 years. And as I said, what you see here is that clearly the UK, or in this example, the UK and Ireland, I've grouped together just to make it a bit easier, is by far the biggest market for sales to rental companies in Europe. A much bigger market, well, Germany is a much bigger market on its own. If you sort of take the traditional Germany, Austria, Switzerland grouping, it's very much bigger than the UK and Ireland. But you see sales to rental are, you know, nowhere close to what you see in the UK and Ireland. France is traditionally a big rental market, but actually in 2020, the DACH region was actually slightly bigger. But I mean, you can see as these curves sort of ebb and flow, that is something that kind of comes and goes with the different fortunes of each market. Benelux, you know, a relatively small market in unit terms, but as a rental market, bigger than Italy. As we saw earlier, Italy is not a particularly developed rental market. And then you have the Scandinavia, Nordic region, which are decent sized markets and where rental is important. And then Iberia, which again are fairly reasonable sized markets, but where rental isn't very well developed. So I think that illustrates how you can sort of build a profile, looking at it from the point of view of buyer groups and how that sort of brings a lot more understanding. The other thing I've done in looking at rental is looking at what types of equipment rental companies buy. Probably no surprise that mini excavators are the biggest one, but rental companies are also a very big buyer of telehandlers. Crawler excavators, I would say, to a lesser extent, and wheel loaders even less pronounced. I think the one that stands out there is probably wheeled excavators. And again, it illustrates this point that, you know, wheeled excavators are an important product group in Europe. They're, you know, just about in the high volume category, but in terms of sales to rental, they're really not that important. It's a type of machine that is much more often bought by contractors, and particularly in certain markets by these sort of sole trader kind of contractors. So I've used rental as an example here, but you can do this for any of our equipment types. If you really dig into this and look at what drives changes, I mean, I think the first thing to say that year-on-year changes in any given product type in any given country are small. They really are. That's something that's come out very clearly in the work in building this database. Typically, you'd be talking about, you know, 1 to 2% swing from rental to contractors or whatever it might be, you know, if that in a year. So what moves the dial on a European level is actually the changes for big countries, you know, obviously particularly big markets. And that's, you know, perhaps an obvious statement, but it bears saying. Obviously, if the UK market grows or sinks, that actually moves the dial for how many machines European rental as a whole is buying. And likewise, you know, if there's a big surge or a big fall in mini excavators, that is actually because rental companies are buying more or less mini excavators. And obviously that affects, the volume of machines sold to rental. So, they're the kind of changes that we see. There are long-term trends in each individual country. On a year-to-year basis, they don't make a big change, but you have a lot of different dynamics going on in Europe, which can move the needle sort of significantly year to year. So just to summarize the changes that we've seen, there is a clear trend in buying patterns, the move to rental from contractor ownership. Maybe not as pronounced in the last 10 years as we might have expected, but the trend is certainly there. We have seen growth in some niche applications. Activities like forestry and landscaping have always been there. I think what we're seeing is greater mechanization of those activities. We've also seen, more and more machines sold into this world of waste management, recycling, and demolition, which we would think is probably a trend that's indicative of growth in that sector, of greater recycling in particular. So just for the final section, I want to say something about machine populations. So this isn't something that we can directly provide from our data, but it is something that is a very simple exercise to work on if you have access to our data. So what we say to our clients who are interested in the aftermarket is, okay, you want to know the machine population. The way we would advocate doing it is look at what the average lifespan for each equipment type is. So say if you're looking at mini excavators and you think, right, they last 6 years on average, just do a rolling total of 6 years of mini excavator sales, and you'll get a profile of the population and how that's changing over time. So that's always been possible. Obviously now what you can do is start to estimate the machine population by customer group. So again, if you're in that aftermarket space, I think this could be quite interesting for understanding, where your client groups are. The other thing that we say about populations in general is, it is an estimate. So there's a lot to be said for modeling different scenarios, sort of saying, okay, we'll try mini excavators with an average lifespan of 6 years, but let's also try 5, let's also try 7 or 8, and just to try and get an understanding of how that changes things and how that reality checks with the business that you do. And obviously what you can do now is do that same sort of modeling estimate exercise with different customer groups. So you could say, all right, well, we'll look at mini excavators in general, as we will in a minute, and just say, okay, what happens if we assume rental companies own their machines for a shorter period and contractors own them for longer? So we'll come on to that, but first of all, the whole thing about population estimates. This, as I said, is a very simple exercise, and this is what you come up with for the European population of equipment, about 1.1 million machines, based on different lifespans for these different machine types. So obviously things like mini excavators would be relatively short-lived compared to machines like bigger crawler excavators or wheel loaders, and also quite a lot of these machines in the other categories. You're talking about things like dozers, graders, dump trucks, which tend to have very long lives. It's a bit of a digression, but what you see is that because most lifespans are longer than the cycle in the market, population is sometimes somewhat counterintuitive. So back here in 2010 and 2011, sales of construction equipment in Europe were very, very low coming out of those global financial crisis years. But the population still remained very high because you had all those years of high sales in the 2000s. Those machines were still in the population. And what you saw in the middle part of the last decade, in 2015, is that finally worked its way out of the system, and you had a very, very small population of equipment just as construction activity started to pick up. So we feel that's one of the driving factors why from 2016 to 2019 you saw very steep growth in sales in Europe. It's not particularly that construction activity really took off, but you kind of hit this point where construction was growing and there just weren't many machines in the market to do that work. And similarly in 2020, of course, as I said earlier, construction equipment sales in 2020 fell 15%, but the population still grew. And that's because although sales were lower, they were still higher than kind of the year they replaced back here. So that's a bit of a digression on populations, but it does illustrate the fact that it tells you something different about the market, and probably gives a bit more of an insight into the market. So coming back on track and just talking a little bit about customer groups, if you look at the mini excavators and just use that rule of thumb of a 6-year lifespan, this is what you start to see in terms of the population of machines. So obviously still building through 2020, mini excavator sales actually held up very well last year, and growing out into our forecast period. Rental is, again, the biggest segment, but you're also seeing growth in the population of mini excavators owned by contractors. And so that's something that's significant, and that's not something that you would necessarily expect from a sort of a casual observer's point of view. And you're also seeing a bit of growth in the number of mini excavators in the landscaping segment, for example. So again, just illustrative of the kind of work that you can do with this data and the kind of understanding you can get. The final point I'm going to make on this is, as I said, you may take the view that certain groups hold on to their machines for a relatively long time and others not so much. So you can also model this. So if you took the population in 2020 and just estimated it based on, let's just say everybody keeps their mini excavators for about 6 years, then you get a picture like this. A very big population in rental, still quite big population in contractors. But if you took a slightly different view and you just sort of plugged in different years and you said, okay, what if we said rental companies just keep their mini excavators on average for 5 years, but contractors keep them a bit longer, and maybe the public sector does. So you start to get a different view of what the different populations are in each of these customer groups. And as I said before, if the aftermarket is important to your business and getting an understanding of that, these sorts of exercises can be really, really valuable, because you can model different scenarios, you can reality check against what you know from your business, and then start to get a clear understanding of the population out there. And then obviously with forecasting, you get a view of what the population is going to be, who's going to own those machines, and where in Europe they're going to be. So that's about it in terms of the presentation. I see we have a few questions coming in, so I'll come to them in a minute. As I said, this is a service which we have available now. So if you're interested, please do contact us or have a look on our website and download the brochure on the customer group database service. If you have any questions, please, as I said, put them in the Q&A channel. If you have any follow-ups from this webinar that we don't get to, or if you'd like any specific follow-ups on anything I've touched on, please feel free to get in contact with me directly, as well as the obvious things of visiting our website and following us on LinkedIn. So let us get away from PowerPoint and have a look at the Q&A channel, and let's see what's come in. Here's a question about, will the material follow at the end of the webinar? Yes. You should, in about 20-25 minutes, receive an email with a link to download that. So yes, they will come from the KHL Group eCast system. So if it doesn't land in your inbox, it might be an idea to check your spam and your junk as well. A question about agricultural tractors. Agricultural tractors are not included in this data. It's just an exercise we've done for pure construction equipment. A question about, I did mention 100-ton dump trucks. where a dump truck's in this data. In terms of the graphs, they pretty much always fell in the others segment. If you get into the database, obviously the data's there and it's very detailed, but in terms of just looking at volumes in Europe, you're talking about relatively small numbers. So for the clarity of the graphs, I put them together in the others category. What have we got? Electrification. Excellent. It's not a webinar without talking about electrification. Very interesting one. We feel that electrification is finally happening in Europe. Clearly, we've started to have electric machines actually commercially available in the European market in the last year, maybe a little bit longer. And obviously, that's very different from just a prototype being on show at a trade show. So these machines are now being made. They are out there. We feel that the numbers are still very small. There are only a couple of suppliers making them, and we think even for those suppliers, it's a pretty small percentage of the number of machines that they're selling. So even on the global basis, and electrification is happening in China as well, actually, we should say that, particularly in the compact wheel loader segment. But in a market that's going to be 1.15 million machines this year, you're probably talking about 1,000 or 2,000 electric machines. So it is happening, but it's not really big numbers. It is something we hope to start to cover in our data and in our reports moving forward. But really, this is just the first year, the first real year, we would say, of probably the next century. So we will pick up our coverage as it gains more momentum. Another question, do you make a distinction between wheel loaders above and below 80 horsepower? Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Again, for the clarity of the graphs, it's something that I just put all wheel loaders together. But in our data, they are separate equipment categories. And obviously, and as you would expect, very different sort of buyer group profiles for those different types of equipment. When do you expect customer group coverage to expand to the US? Yeah, we'll go there. We're working on it, and we hope to have some news in the new year about how we're going to do that. A similar question, how about Eastern Europe? Again, we are looking to extend our coverage into Eastern Europe. It's something we, frankly wanted to do 18 months ago, but obviously the situation with travel has just made that impossible, because to provide the kind of services that we provide, you really have to sit down with people face to face and have a very long conversation. And of course, that really hasn't been possible. So hopefully next year, as the winter infection spike lifts and travel becomes more feasible, we hope to put those plans into action. So fingers crossed on that one. What else do we have? What types of companies are included in your contractor segment? So in our reports, if you're familiar with them, you will see that when we discuss customer groups, we do sort of break down somewhat into, small and medium, large contractors. For certain equipment types, road building contractors might be more important, or general contractors, or we may look at building contractors. The whole point about this exercise and this database is kind of standardizing that so you can look at the big trends. So our contractor groups would include any of those companies. So really, it's any company any construction company that buys the machine and uses it. So that would extend from, as I said, the sole trader, the person that just buys a machine and does work locally, right up to the large multinational companies that buy their own equipment. So that's our definition of contractor for the purposes of this exercise. We don't break it down within the database, because the point of the database is to kind of group these things together and pick out the big trends. but that information is still there in our reports if you need to take a deep dive into whatever equipment type and whatever market it is. What is the lifespan you considered for telescopic handlers? I can't remember off the top of my head, unfortunately, but it is a fairly standard number that we give to our customers if they want to do this exercise. That's from anonymous attendee. If you'd like to drop me an email after this event, I'm very happy to share that number with you. I just don't have it now. Do we have any statistics on stationary equipment? No, we don't, unfortunately. Our coverage is predominantly those machines I showed at the start. So it's predominantly mobile machines and mobile machines, you know, with a cab, obviously. So we don't cover stationary machines. What else do we have? Can we also have data about producers? I'm not really sure where that one's coming from, but just to clarify, this data is about sales of construction equipment and sales to customer groups. So we also have a data set which looks at, which gives sales by brand, by country and by equipment type, and also production by OEM, equipment type and country. So these are two separate data sets. So we don't have sales by manufacturer and by customer group, unfortunately. It would be wonderful if we did, but it's just not really possible to research that. So yes, we have sales by equipment manufacturer, by brand, and separately we have this new data about customer groups, but they aren't, they are separate data sets, I would say. Is there any reason why MUPs are not included in the exercise? Yes, unfortunately, we don't cover MUPs for or access platforms for historic reasons in Europe. It's not something that's really been part of our coverage for a couple of decades now. I am seeing a note that there are a lot of questions in the chat channel as well. I will just hop across to that and just kind of see what we're seeing. A little bit of chat. I'm sorry to see a few people had a little bit of trouble getting onto this, but as I said, the slides will be available afterwards, and we will also post a recording of this on YouTube. Yeah, so one question about the geographic coverage. At the moment, this data is only available for Europe, but we will be adding other countries. We've done the preliminary work on India and China, which are two other important markets where we do a lot of research, and we just have to validate that somewhat, but we hope to get that out in the new year. A question, another one about definition. In the UK, equipment rental is sometimes called plant hire. So yes, in our definition in the UK, rental is a more generic term, but in the UK terms, that would include, you know, what are called here plant hire companies, and they would be different from contractors. Okay, just whizzing through. Quite a few duplicated questions, I would say. Yeah, there are a few questions about machine types which I didn't mention. Just for clarification, when you receive the slides, the equipment that is covered in this presentation is that list on slide 3 or 4 or whatever it is. If it's not on there, it's not included in the graphs and is generally not included in our coverage. You know, we cover what we cover. There are obviously other construction equipment types, many other construction equipment types, which are outside our coverage. So yeah, just for clarification, that's, you know, the market that we present, and that's our coverage. Yeah, so just scanning quickly through the chat channel, that does seem to cover most things. If you have any more questions, I would emphasize, do put them in the Q&A channel and I'll try and get to them. quite a few questions on the Indian construction equipment market, slightly randomly. I will touch on them as they've been asked. Obviously, it has been a difficult time, the COVID pandemic, particularly for India. Coming out of 2019, 2019 was kind of quite a weak year in India because it was disrupted by the general election. 2 years ago, almost the day, I remember being at the Bangalore exhibition, EXCON, and the mood there was great. You know, business was clearly very strong. Then obviously the COVID pandemic hit, and it did hit India very hard and in a number of ways over the next 18 months. So we saw the market fall in 2020. There was a rebound in 2021, but obviously it wasn't as strong as we saw in other parts of the world. We do see the Indian market continuing to grow. Long term, we still think it's a very, very strong market. There's infrastructure investment happening on a very big scale in India. And the current government has done a lot to actually make that work and to actually not just talk about it, but put the money in place. So long term, we see great prospects. And I would hope, India tends to have these 5-year cycles between elections. Our forecast currently foresees that in the next 2 to 3 years, we will see a new peak, a new record high in India before the disruption of the next election. But overall, we do see a fairly clear long-term growth path for the Indian construction equipment. Okay, they're all the questions that we've had in, and we're running a little bit short on time. As I said, if anybody has any follow-ups, please feel free to get in contact with me directly. Follow us on LinkedIn or follow our webpage. As I said, you should receive the slides via eCast, hopefully by the end of the working day, wherever you are in the world. Apologies if the working day is already finished wherever you are in the world, but hopefully in the next half hour, they should be in your inbox, but please check your junk folders as well. So I just to bring things to a close, I'd just like to thank again our sponsors, Lawson's Recruitment, who really have been great with their support and help make this webinar happen. And thank you also to our media partner, Construction Europe, which has been really fantastic in helping get the word out about this. We certainly hope to hold more webinars in 2022, and if the situation permits it, we will hold in-person events. We have 2 planned, and we'll give you some news about that as soon as the plans are firmed up and we're confident they can go ahead. So please keep an eye on the news page of our website, offhighwayresearch.com. Also follow us on LinkedIn, where we'll post information and details about those events when it becomes available. So finally, thank you very much for attending this webinar, and I hope to see you again soon, and I hope to see you in person soon. So thanks very much.